All right, 1 Corinthians 11. So we are going to try to lay out here tonight what is happening here in 1 Corinthians 11 in regards to head coverings. I had a couple of things I intended to say in the beginning. Thanks, brother. But to be honest with you, as I began to write out, just sort of verse by verse, dealing with the passage, it was too long, and so I've cut everything out in the beginning. We're just going to read it and jump right into it. So I'm just going to read the passage first. So we're going to start in verse 2. This is one of those places where the chapter division is not an ideal situation. But nevertheless, it is what it is. So we're going to start in verse 2, and we will read through verse 16. 1 Corinthians 11, verse 2. Now I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions, even as I delivered them to you. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. But every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. For if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it is disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. For a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. That is why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, because of the angels. Nevertheless, in the Lord, woman is not independent of man, nor man of woman. For as woman was made from man, so man is now born of woman, and all things are from God. Judge for yourselves. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? But if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. If anyone is inclined to be contentious, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. All right, so let me just say this. What are some things in there that as you all hear it, even before we begin to deal with it, that you would wonder, what in the world is that saying? Anything that as we read it, you just go, okay, we need some clarification on that.
The angels.
Okay. Yeah, so are you mentioning the same thing? Okay, all right. What else?
Verse 15, her hair is given to her for a covering.
Okay.
What does that mean?
What else? Listen, this is a passage that has been debated for some time. So I recognize that there is all kinds of stuff in here that people have questions about. What are some other things in here that... Huh?
Bing, bing, bing.
Okay. All right. Some of these we will deal with. Some of these we will not.
What does it mean that Christ, or the head of Christ is God, if Jesus is God?
Okay. Again, some of these we will deal with, and some of these we will not. Any other ones?
Yeah, verse 16, if anyone is inclined to be contentious.
Okay. All right, well, I hope as we work through it that I'm going to spend, as much as time as I can on each verse trying to explain every bit of it that I can. So if there is any question here about some of this, what I would ask is this. Write it down, and we'll come back to it at the end. I only say that because if we get off somewhere, we may be here 2 hours, and I can't do a 2-hour Bible study. So if you have something, write it down. We'll do questions at the end, if there are any, and we'll try to flesh everything out. So what I'm going to do, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to walk through the passage all the way through, starting in verse 2 all the way to the end. After we get to the end, I have here a couple of conclusions. This is basically going to be, after we deal with the text, we're going to try to lay out, okay, what do we take away from this? What are the applications? And then what I want to do after that is deal with different arguments that have been made about this passage, other interpretations, and try to deal with them. All right, so let's look right here at the beginning, verse 2. He says, I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions even as I delivered them to you. So right out of the gate, Paul is commending them for what they're doing. He's going to come across here in verse 17 when he jumps into the next section in Lord's Supper. And he's actually going to say, but in the following instructions, I do not commend you. So here he's actually commending them. They're actually doing something well. They're following his instructions. They're maintaining, he says, you're maintaining the traditions that he delivered to them. And so really, honestly, as we just read this, I think what we need to consider for ourselves is that we would make sure that we as well are commended by Paul for maintaining the things that are delivered. So then he says this. He says, I commend you because you remember me in everything and maintain the traditions. Now, we typically hear that word and we think, not good, right? We think traditions of men. Jesus rebuked the Pharisees for that kind of thing. And he did. But there are a number of places where this word is used in the New Testament. And what we want to do is concern ourselves with how does Paul define traditions and what does he think about traditions? Because yes, like I said, Jesus did. I mean, he rebuked the Pharisees for their traditions. He called them traditions of men and he rebuked them for it. But Paul does speak differently about traditions. And the word really just means teaching that was passed down. The idea is it's just teaching. That's all it is. And so think about this for a minute. I mean, I have it listed here, but I want to ask you all, can you think of anywhere else where Paul talks about traditions that he gave? Anybody recall it?
Think about the foundations that he laid, that kind of idea.
Okay.
You're saying where he says the word tradition?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, somewhere in 1 Timothy.
I think you're what? Give me the off the top of your head, just the idea.
To pay attention to the traditions you upon. Doesn't he tell Timothy?
Yeah. Okay. So you're thinking of the right text. It's in 2 Thessalonians.
Yeah, there. Yup.
That's what I meant.
So 2 Thessalonians chapter 2. So here is what Paul wants us to do with the traditions that he delivered. 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 15. So then, brothers, stand firm and hold to the traditions that you were taught by us, either by our spoken word or by our letter. So Paul says, listen, I want you to stand firm in these things. I want you to hold on to them. Don't lose them. These are things that we taught you, either by spoken word or by letter. And certainly the Corinthians would have received it both ways. Certainly Paul, when he was in Corinth, taught them about head coverings, and then he sends them the letter, 1 Corinthians, so they get it both ways. But Paul wants us to maintain these things. And now we've received them in letter form, of course. So, brethren, we need to stand firm in them. We need to hold to them. That's how Paul thinks about the traditions. Then he says this, that he delivered them. Now, that might seem right out of the gate like, okay, why is that? So what? He delivered them. He said them. He told them. But there is more to this. This is actually a pretty big deal. when Paul says that he delivered them, what that means is that these things were not so much Paul's ideas as much as they are traditions given by God. They're things from God. Paul, when he says he delivered them, that means he's nothing but the delivery man. He's not the manufacturing man. He didn't make it up. He's not trying to be clever here and come up with some idea. Paul is simply delivering things to the church. And you have the same exact language in a couple of places in 1 Corinthians. If you just turn over, well, maybe it's right on the same page, but right there when he's talking about the Lord's Supper, chapter 11, verse 23, he says, I received from the Lord what I also delivered to you. So this is what Paul is teaching and giving about the Lord's Supper. And it's the same language. He received it, he's delivering it. And then you have the same exact language again in chapter 15 when he's going to talk about the gospel. I mean, just the message of salvation. Chapter 15, verse 3, Paul says, I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. So you have the same language in both of those places. So Paul is simply here delivering this stuff. He's not making this up. This isn't his ideas. This isn't his theology. It is of divine origin. And Paul is simply wanting to deliver this stuff to the church. Now look at verse 3. He says, but I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ, the head of a wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. So right out of the gate, Paul says, I want you to understand. And that is good, right? Paul wants us to understand, and we should want to understand. Brethren, the PhDs are all up in arms about what in the world this passage is saying, and yet Paul says, I want you to understand. I mean, if we don't understand, then Paul had no idea what he was trying to deal with here. You got to remember, the people in this church, they're common folk. I mean, Paul is not intending to be very complex here. He's trying to be pretty straightforward. And Paul says, I want you to understand. And so he's writing to this church because he wants them to more fully grasp something that it seems like they're already doing. You see this. He says, you maintain the traditions that I delivered. So they're already doing it. They're already practicing it, but he's wanting to sort of come back again to this idea and give some more specific teaching. He wants them to understand the reasoning behind it. Why are they doing what they're doing? Don't just do it for the sake of doing it, but why? What are the theological reasons? What are the implications? Why is it that when a man prays or prophesies, he should not cover his head? And why is it that when a woman prays or prophesies, she should cover her head? He wants to tell them why. And I think this is actually, I was thinking about this week as I was kind of preparing things, and I thought to myself, you know what? This is very much the case I feel in our own church. I mean, some of you here have practiced this because it's the practice of the church, but you haven't really received much of a real teaching on it. And it's like, I feel Paul's heart in this situation. He's wanting to say, look, I want you to understand why you're doing this. I commend you for doing it. You've maintained the traditions that have been taught. I commend you for it. But look, I want you to understand it. I want you to get it. I want you to grasp it. Why are you doing what you're doing? And I have sort of felt some of that this week as I began to work through this. And so listen, can the passage be difficult in some particulars? Yes. There are some areas here which are harder than others. I don't want to be a fool and say everything here is easy. But brethren, the church, for its entire history, up until about 80 years ago, was not confused on this passage. The church, for almost its entire history, knew pretty well what this passage said, and they knew how to apply it. There really wasn't any debate on it. I got right here this commentary set, Ancient Christian Commentary on Scripture. You can open that up, and every single church father that you'll read about, that goes only up until maybe the 400s or 500s, but all of them had the same view. You go all the way through church history, you're going to find very, very, very few people that are going to deviate from what Paul says here. So the church, throughout its history, up until about 80 years ago, really was not very confused on what Paul was saying here. When he says, I want you to understand, the church understood it for most of its history. But then he says this, the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife is her husband. And the head of Christ is God. Now he's going to begin to explain all of this. And he wants to begin here with a statement about authorities. And look, we use this kind of language as well. If I say to you, the president is the head of the United States, you all know what I mean. He's the authority. He's the leader. That's the guy in charge. And so here, Paul says, Christ is the head, and he's using this as a metaphorical term. Christ is the head or authority of a man. The husband is the head or authority of his wife, and God is the head of Christ. So you have here this distinction. God is a head, Christ is a head, the husband is a head, the wife is not a head. She is not, in the theology here, in 1 Corinthians 11, she is not an authority figure. And brethren, there's nothing cultural about that. There's nothing cultural about the fact that God is the head of Christ. That's not cultural. There's nothing cultural about the fact that a husband is the head of his wife. I mean, these things are rooted in the Trinitarian order of God himself. Paul's theology has nothing here cultural. Everything right here is rooted in the existence of who God is and how God has ordered everything. Now, I want to say this, because there's a question here as to how these words should be translated. Because it says here, man, husband, wife. So the thing is this, in the Greek, the words for man and husband and the words for woman and wife are the same words. So the context determines how you would translate it. It's the same word for woman as it is for wife, and it's the same word for man as it is for husband. So the translators are going to come to the text, and they're going to have to determine here, okay, do we translate this husband or do we translate it man? Do we translate this woman or do we translate this wife? And I guess people can go back and forth on that question about this particular passage. What I would say is this. I think the ESV is right in translating it, the head of a wife is her husband. And the reason I would say that is this. If we're trying to bring in all of Scripture to help us understand what is being said in the Bible, let me ask you this. Does the Bible teach that every woman is subject to every man? It does not teach that. Does the Bible teach that every wife is subject to her own husband? Okay, give me a text. Prove it.
This one.
Okay. yeah. Out of this one. Apart from this one. Okay. Okay, let's hear it. Whatever text you're thinking of.
Ephesians 5:22. Wives, submit to your own husbands.
Okay. There you go. There's many others. I had 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1. Wives, be subject to your own husbands. So here's why I'm going to say I think the translation is right. It's because the Bible does not teach that every woman is subject to all men. The Bible is very clear in teaching that a wife is subject to her husband. So if I'm going to take in all of Scripture and try to understand what is happening here in this particular text, I think we have to understand it that way. It would make no sense to say that every woman is subject to every man. And so for that reason, I think the translation here is proper. So then, verse 4 and 5. Paul just stated this whole authoritative structure that God has ordered, and so now he's going to he's going to build on this whole thing, and he's going to explain why it is that why does this authority structure matter when it comes to the realm of head coverings. And so then right here, he's going to begin to shift back and forth. In verses 4 and 5, he's going to shift back and forth between the reference to the head as the authority figure, which he already dealt with there in verse 3. So the head as an authority figure, and the head in the physical sense, like this, like the head on your body. And so he says, every man who prays or prophesies with his head, his physical head, covered, dishonors his spiritual head, his authoritative head, Christ. And vice versa for the woman. If she prays without her physical head covered, she dishonors her spiritual or authoritative head. And then you have here in verse 5 at the end, he says, since it is the same as if her head were shaven. So he says, if she won't cover her head when she's praying and prophesying, Paul says it's the same as if her head were shaven. And we might immediately think, well, what in the world does that mean? Why does that even matter? Why is the idea of a shaved head such a big deal? Well, I want you to consider this for a minute. I want you to recognize something. Folks, there is a reason why when people like Britney Spears shave their head, it ends up on the front page of a magazine. Now, that may have been many, many years ago at this point, but there's a reason why that happens. And let me ask you this. You imagine you're outside walking down the street and someone with a woman with a shaved head comes by you. She's bald. I mean, what is your first thought? Right? And listen, that is not a matter of you being judgmental. Okay? Paul is going to himself later on appeal to the facts of nature for this whole thing. He says later on, verse 14, we'll get to it in a second, I'm just saying here. He says later on in verse 14, does not nature itself teach you? So he himself is going to appeal to nature. He said, does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? And folks, we can turn that right around and say, does not nature also teach you that if a woman shaves her head, it is disgraceful for her? And listen, even though our culture has made effeminate men normal and men with long hair some kind of normal phenomena, the fact of the matter is this: there is still some degree of a stigma for women who shave themselves bald. And there should be. There should be that kind of stigma for that. There is something disgraceful about a woman who chops off her hair and goes around bald. There's something disgraceful about that, brethren. And don't think for a minute, listen, you might be sitting here and you feel in your heart an aversion to that kind of thing. You can see it in your mind and you think, oh, something's not right. You feel the aversion, but then immediately you come in here and go, well, wait, maybe that's because I'm just judgmental. Maybe that's because my own ideas. Maybe that's because the way I think. Brethren, it's not because you're some radical, judgmental Neanderthal. It's because that is how God has made you. That is internally wired in you. Something about that is not right. Brethren, when the hippies grew their hair long in the 60s, they did so for a particular reason. They did so in rebellion to God. And the feminists today who want to make themselves bald, they do so for the same reasons. They do it in rebellion to God. And the point is to say this, folks, this is not a cultural matter. This is something that we recognize across culture. Women that make themselves bald, we recognize something is not right about that. And people want to, you can open all kinds of commentaries, and people are going to say, oh, this is because the prostitutes in that day shaved their heads, and this was some kind of bad thing. Listen, even if the prostitutes in that day didn't shave their heads, this would still be abnormal. There would something still be about this that is contrary to nature. And look, I guess let me just say this as a side note. This obviously has nothing to do with the situation where a woman has lost her hair due to any number of other circumstances. Whether it might be cancer that causes that to happen, or I was talking to Michael this week, I thought, I don't doubt that you could probably find somewhere some testimony of the early church. I mean, they believed these things. They believed that the hair was the glory of a woman. And I bet you somewhere at some time, some place was persecuting Christians, and they probably shaved women's heads bald to try to humiliate them. And you know what? In that situation, the woman would not be in sin for that. She doesn't want her head bald. She's not intentionally trying to make herself bald. Nevertheless, though, recognize this, she would feel disgraced by it. And let me just ask the question here. I think in the situation, like I said, I want us to recognize that this is not a matter of if someone happens to lose their hair that they're now in sin, but But in your situation, as you started going through chemo, as you were starting to lose your hair, undoubtedly you probably felt the need to cover your head, right? And it's not because you committed some sin that you had to do that, but there was something in you that just felt like I'm losing something of who I am as a woman. And there's a feeling of saying, no, I want to cover my head. I need to do something, right? And this is just to say that there's something ingrained there. I mean, like I said, there's no sin here in something happening where that happens to a woman where she's not desiring to do that, right? There's the idea is a woman who is intentionally trying to make herself bald. There's this idea of rebellion there. But embedded in the situation is this idea that even if a woman loses her hair and she doesn't want to, she doesn't intend to, there's a recognition on her part that this is not right. I don't want this. This isn't, I feel like something's off here. And that's because that is in the heart, brethren. That's in the heart. There's something about nature that speaks to us about this. All right? So, now in verse 6, he's going to say this. He wants to make the point abundantly clear. And so similarly, Paul kind of uses this same kind of language in other parts of the Bible. He kind of does it in Galatians. He basically tells the church, he's built this whole argument against, get away from circumcision. Don't let these people lead you into this. And he tells the church at Galatia, he essentially builds this argument. He says, look, if you want circumcision, then you might as well just go all the way, take the whole law, condemn yourself. If you want circumcision, just take the whole thing. Go out that way with the law and condemn yourself. And he kind of does something similar here to make his point. He says, for if a wife will not cover her head, then she should cut her hair short. But since it's disgraceful for a wife to cut off her hair or shave her head, let her cover her head. So he says, look, if she won't cover her head, just make her shave her head. If she don't want to do it, then just go all the way. Just shave her head, make her go bald. But the thing is, Paul knows that they recognize that's an absurdity. There's something they know. Nature tells us that's not right. And so he turns it around and he says, but since it's disgraceful, he knows they know this. Right? This is nature working here. He says, but listen, you know this. I mean, since it's disgraceful for a wife to shave her head, well, then let her cover her head. I mean, he's trying to tell these people this. He wants them, he's saying, guys, come on. If a wife won't cover her head, that to you is like she just walked into the meeting and just at home shaved her head bald, and now here she comes walking into the church meeting. And you know that that's not right. So then have her cover her head. I mean, that's the idea. He's trying to appeal to them sort of on this emotional level argument to say, look, if she won't do this, this is what it's like. And we know you all don't recognize that that's a good thing. We know that you all recognize by nature that something about that, a woman being bald, is not right. And so he says, then have her cover her head. I mean, it's really that simple. Do what's right, he's saying. And then he says in verse 7, he's going to begin to sort of flesh out his theological case, his theological reasons for this. Why is it that a man should not cover his head, and why is it that a wife should cover hers? So he says, because, he says, man, for a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. So that's his idea. He's saying man is the image and glory of God, but woman is the image and glory of man. And listen, this is God's order. This is how God has made things. Man is to reflect God, and the woman is to reflect him, her husband. And listen, the fact of the matter is this. This is not demeaning. It's not any more demeaning than it was for Christ to do the very same thing. Listen, Hebrews 1:3, it says that Jesus Christ is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature. So folks, Christ was the radiance of the glory of God. That's what he did. He displayed the glory of God. Just as the wife ought to be the glory of her husband. Jesus tells Philip, John 14:9, whoever has seen me has seen the Father. How can you say, show us the Father? So the Son reflects the Father and the Father's nature. And in the same way, wives, you are to reflect your husbands. I mean, this is biblical. This is how God has ordered things. And listen, don't despise it. I mean, why would you despise it? It's God's good order. It's how He's made you. And listen, you are like Christ when you do that. You follow in the footsteps of Christ. And we want to be like Christ. And then he's gonna make his theological case for what he just said. All right? So he just said, woman is the glory of man. And now he's going to make the theological case for that. In this text, there's arguments within arguments. And here is one of those arguments within an argument. Because you notice what he says right away. He begins verse 8 with for. All right? So he says in verse 7, for a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But woman is the glory of man. For. Now he's going to say why. Why is it, Paul? How can you say that? How can you say the woman is the glory of man? And he's going to say, well, this is why. I get it from God's created order. And then he tells us, for man was not made from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. So you see, he's building this theological case. So he says, not only was man not made from woman, but woman from man, but he says, who was created for whom? He says that man was not created for woman, but the other way around, that woman was created for man. Listen, the feminists want to hate us for that, but that's just what the Bible says. And this is our proof for why we ought to view the wife as the glory of her husband. It's rooted in creation, folks. Eve was made from Adam, and Eve was made for Adam. That's right there in creation. She was made to be his helper. She's from him, and she's for him, and she glorifies him. And again, this is just simply God's good order. That's how He's made it. When we operate in that realm, we operate how God wants us to operate. When we try to get away from that, we remove ourselves from how God has structured things. And remember, brethren, that is structured based upon the relation in the Trinity. This is not just some separate thing. This is built upon God Himself, how God relates to Himself in the Godhead. And God is wanting us to act that out in our relationship as husband and wife. And so now here we are, verse 10. Verse 10 is probably the most difficult out of the entire section. And that's because there are two major difficulties with verse 10. The first one is the whole verse could be taken two different ways. And then depending on which way you take the verse, defining the angels could be defined. Take your pick, right? So here's the first way it could be understood. The first way is this. Paul is going to say that a wife ought to have a head covering on when she prays or prophesies as a symbol of authority because of the point that he had just previously made. Namely, that the woman is the glory of man. You see that in verse 7, at the end of verse 7 there. And I say that because after all, this is the point that he was working on. He states it in verse 7, at the end of verse 7 there. He defends it by the created order in verses 8 and 9. And then he comes back to it to rest his case on that particular point. So that he would be saying she should have a symbol of authority on her head because she was made from man, she was made for man, and she is the glory of man. She's to glorify him. So that would be the argument that Paul would be making there in verse 10. The other way it could be taken is this, to say that Paul's reason is based on the following statement, not the previous one. In other words, Paul would be saying that the wife should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Whatever that might mean. We'll deal with that in a second. After all, doesn't it say right there because of the angels? So there's two different ways that you could take and interpret this verse. And I'm going to say this first before we even determine which way is proper. Whichever interpretation you take, folks, neither of them are cultural. Whether it has something to do with God's created order or whether it has something to do with the angels, brethren, those are bigger realities than the culture aspect. Paul is definitely not saying that she should wear a symbol on authority on her head because of these cultural situations. He's either saying she should do it because of the created order, or he's saying she should do it because of the angels. And both of those are way bigger than any cultural situation that was happening at the time. So, in interpreting it, like I said, people have gone both ways. But I prefer the first interpretation. And I say that because it seems to flow best with what has been happening in the context already. It seems that Paul is building his theological case, his theological argument, from verse 7. And he's basically saying, that's his conclusion there in verse 10, that a wife ought to cover her head as a symbol of authority because she is the glory of man. That seems to be the implication. And Paul's going to say later on, this is why this kind of fits into the whole argument, because Paul's going to say later on that the woman's hair is her glory. And so if we're going to try to understand Paul's theology here, he seems to be indicating that when a woman is praying or prophesying, that she should cover her own glory so as to glorify her authoritative head. That's the idea, right? The whole idea is she's created from him, for him, and to glorify him. And Paul's argumentation seems to be that when she's going to pray or prophesy, she should cover her head so as to veil her own glory to glory him. Okay? I think that's the whole idea from verse 7 onward into verse 10. And so someone might object, well, if it has to do with reasons pertaining to the created order, wouldn't it have always been required that women cover their heads, not just now? Not just how Paul is saying it now for the church. Wouldn't it have always been required if it has to do with the created order? Something that's more important than the cultural situation? And so I think there's two things in which we can say about this particular point. The first one would be this. The church, as God has established it now in the New Testament, the church and how it functions is a new thing. That's not at all, it's a new thing. The church is a new thing that God has now established. And even when you think about some of the other things that Paul builds upon and establishes in the New Testament, he does this with the prohibition of women being pastors. You know what? A Christian pastor did not exist for all of history up until this point. Up until now we have churches where there's pastors that oversee the flocks. And yet Paul can take this new reality of a Christian pastor, and where does he root it in 1 Timothy? He goes all the way back to creation with it. I mean, Paul, how can you root it in creation? It never even existed before. And he says, well, it's because the principles here are rooted in creation. Even though this reality is new, the principles are not new. They're old. They're rooted way back there. And so the church, even though it is a new thing, the life of the church, the function of the church, and these different Christian symbols, although they are a new thing, the reasons for them are not new. They seem to be rooted in the created order. But even on top of that, it does seem to be the fact. I mean, if you go back and you're a careful reader of the Old Testament, you will find that it, in fact, did seem to be pretty normal for women in the Old Testament to cover their heads all throughout Jewish history, even though there is no command for it. You will not find a command in the Old Testament that needs to happen, and yet you find it happening. Now, we may not be familiar with some of these because we don't look for it. We're not determined to go find this in the Old Testament. And so oftentimes we just read over that fact, but it's there. You see Rebecca, for example. She's coming back with the servants, and you know what? She sees Isaac far off in the distance. She dismounts her camel, and what does she do? She covers her head as she goes and she meets Isaac, her soon-to-be husband. If you go into Numbers, you find that a woman who is accused of adultery, that she's to come into the priest and stand before the priest, and he is to unveil her head to determine whether she sinned under her husband's authority. And in that section in Numbers 5, the ESV translates that verse, or that word, unbind, which is incredibly inaccurate of a translation. The word literally means to unveil. That's what it means. If you go to the Greek Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Old Testament, the word there is apocalypto. Anybody know what that word means? Yeah. It's the same word that we use for the book of Revelation. Apocalypto. It's the same word that we use for the book of Revelation. It literally means unveiling. And so this woman who is accused of adultery, she comes into the priest, and he is to unveil her head to determine whether or not she sinned under her husband's authority. In the Song of Solomon, chapter 5, you find this married woman. She's abducted in the streets. She's beaten, and she says, "They took away my veil." Isaiah 3. God speaks about the judgment that is going to come upon Israel. And in part of that judgment, he says the daughters of Zion will have their headdresses or veils taken away. So in the Old Testament, in these judgment passages, and even in Song of Solomon, there's something disgraceful about this. The lover in Song of Solomon is distraught. They took away my veil. And in Isaiah, it's a judgment. And so we have to ask, brethren, why are they doing that? Why is it that this covering of the head seemed to be normative in the Old Testament, even though there was no command for it? My argument would be this: the same as Paul's. Nature. And we'll see how he fleshes that out. Paul appeals to nature in his own argument, and I would say this: they knew it. They knew that there was something to that. So now, we have to ask this. If that's the case, if Paul was building his argument from verse 7, woman is the glory of man, then he backs that claim up in verses 8 and 9, and then he comes in verse 10 and says, that's why a wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head. Why? Because she's the glory of man. Then why the angels? Why are they here? How do they fit into the statement? And who are they? Everybody wants to know that. Well, the first thing is this. The reason they seem to be brought into the statement is this. It's not as though the reason she ought to cover her head is because of the angels, but rather the language seems to indicate that it's so the angels might see it. So when he says, because of the angels, there's a lot of ways that word because can be translated. I mean, there's tons of definitions. But the word because there can really mess us up on trying to interpret it. And so even though someone could get the same conclusion out of this translation, I think it would be maybe better translated to say on account of the angels or for the sake of the angels. And the reason I say that is this. The way we should understand the whole phrase is important. There's one translation that I think is very helpful, and it translates the entire statement in verse 10 like this. For this reason, and we've already explained what that reason seems to be, right? The woman is the glory of man. So the translation says, for this reason, a woman ought to bear on her head an outward sign of authority for all the angels to see. So you see how that should be understood there? I think that's the idea that Paul is getting at here with this idea of because of the angels. Paul's wanting the Corinthians to know, listen, there's an effect here that this has on the angels, whoever they are. It's done so that they can see it. Now that's not the theological reason. The theological reason has been rooted in this whole argument he's been making. But there's something here about these angels. They're seeing this and they're recognizing it. And Paul's saying, that's a good thing. So, of course, we have to ask, who are they? And there's a lot of debate about this. So what I'm going to do is this. I'm going to give you at least 3 of the views And you all can go slay each other outside trying to determine which one it is. The first one is this. The angels are angelic beings who are watching our worship and our interaction. And in fact, they're part of it. They're part of the life of God's people. They're participating in it, even though we don't see them. And they're wanting to see. They're wanting to see the glory of God displayed in what we're doing. I listened to Ryan Fullerton. He's a pastor in Louisville. He had 2 sermons on this passage. I listened to a lot of other people's stuff, trying to make sure that I dealt fairly with the arguments, but he takes this a different way than I do. But he lays this argument out well, and it's actually quite good. But he basically says, look, the angels are wanting to see the glory of God displayed in what we're doing. They're interested in that. They want to see. Are there men displaying the glory of God? Are there women displaying the glory of their husbands? They love to see it. They love to see God's working out in the church. They love to see God's working out in creation. They want to be a part. They love to see how all this that's happening fits into God's order of creation and how He's working all these things out in redemption. They love to see something of heaven on earth. And you know what? If you go back there in the Old Testament, you know what you find the angels doing in the presence of God? Well, they are. But what are they doing with their wings?
Covering their face.
Covering themselves. So anyway, one interpretation is that the angels are angelic beings that are seeing, watching. What is God doing? And they take joy in seeing God's glory being worked out in the world, in the church, in the way things are happening. And they want to see something of the glory of God in heaven displayed on earth in these ways, God's good order being fleshed out. The other way to understand angels is that these aren't angelic beings as we might think of them, but they are human beings, human messengers. After all, the word angel actually just means messenger. Sometimes it's a heavenly messenger and sometimes it's a earthly messenger. So some are going to take it as these aren't angelic beings as we might think of them, but they're earthly messengers, human messengers of some sort. Some take it to be the pastor of the church, and they would connect it with the phrases in Revelation. You see, it says there, to the angel of the church at Sardis, to the angel of the church at Thyatira. And so they're wanting to connect it that way. Some take it just to mean messengers who are going to and fro from the churches, and they're seeing what's happening and explaining to others about what's happening. So that's you have that potential interpretation as well. The other one is this, that the angels are angelic beings, but they are a reference to those angels which fell in Genesis 6. So if you're not familiar with what happened in Genesis 6, it basically speaks about, it calls them the sons of God, and that the sons of God came into the daughters of men, human beings, and they impregnated them, and a lot of wickedness came from that. But basically the idea would be that the reference here is to the angels that fell in Genesis 6, who left their proper dwelling. They indulged in sexual immorality, like Sodom and Gomorrah, as Jude says it, and they came into the daughters of men and impregnated them. Now, if this is the reference, it would seem like Paul's point would be to say, you all know what happened with those angels back there in Genesis. They wickedly lusted after the daughters of men. And you need to display that you were created for men, not for angels. That you were created and you glorify Him, not them. And that your husband is your authority, not them. So potentially that could be the argument as well. Now I will typically go back and forth between 1 and 2. And I haven't really, or 1 and 3. I haven't really fallen dogmatically anywhere. Again, like I said, I heard Ryan Fullerton's argument on that first one, and I don't know if I just liked it so much because of how he preached it or what he said, but I became a little more lenient towards that. But it seems as well, at least in my mind, that the potential of them being referenced to the angels in Genesis 6 could fit what he's saying as well. But anyway, you can determine that yourselves. And then in verse 11 and 12, he's wanting to balance things out, all right? Paul just spent the last couple of verses pointing out that the woman is the glory of man. That woman came from man. She was given for man. And all of that might get a man puffed up. And so Paul is wanting to sort of balance things out here and basically say, now you hold on a minute. Yes, she came from you in the beginning, but now you come for her. Don't you? All these things are from God, right? Yeah, she was made from you, but now you don't even exist without her. And so I think Paul is wanting to sort of balance some of that out, lest any men get puffed up. So that section seems pretty straightforward, so we'll move on. Verse 13. Now, beginning here in verse 13, we have sort of our descent, all right? We've been up at 30,000 feet in all these theological arguments and all this stuff, and now Paul is going to begin to descend here to his conclusion. And he's going to ask a final question, and then he's going to make some closing statements about that particular question, some conclusions here. And this final question carries itself all the way through to verse 16, all the way to the end. And the question is really somewhat rhetorical. He wants the Corinthians to judge the situation for themselves, and he expects their judgment to be the same as his. He asks, is it proper? He says, you judge for yourselves. I mean, he's wanting to put the ball in their court and say, look, folks, tell me what you think about this. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? Paul's answer would be no. And Paul wants the Corinthian church to have a proper judgment of this question. He wants them to answer the question the same way he would answer the question. And so he's going to appeal to nature. So let's look at this, verse 14 and 15. The appeal is for Paul to teach the Corinthians that this principle is already seen, if they would but look at it, it's already seen in the way that God made men and women. And it should indicate to them in nature that a wife should cover her head. He says that nature itself teaches that it is a disgrace for a man to wear long hair. We already kind of dealt with that idea of nature, and, even though our culture wants to get rid of that, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing when culture wants to get rid of things that God has tried to display in nature for us to be opposed to or for. But he says that nature itself teaches that it is a disgrace for a man to wear long hair, but if a woman has long hair, it is her glory. Then he says her hair is given to her for or as a covering. And so the point is this. He's saying, look, folks, if you look out into the world, you look at a woman, you will notice that her hair is given to her as a natural type of covering. In the general way in which God has ordered things, women have longer hair, and they should. In fact, I looked this up just to try to determine the actual biology of the situation. And I probably have too much information in my head about this right now. This is going to sound to you like, why in the world does he know this? But if you actually see how hormones work in men, now listen, you can always have outliers, right? This isn't like a perfect principle, but this is the basic reality of how biology works between women and men. And if you take the biology of a woman and a man, they're different, of course, and the way hair grows, it actually grows in 3 different stages. And the first stage is where the hair is connected to the head. I don't know what all the words are, but the hair is connected there in the little hair,
Follicle.
Yeah, whatever that is. So the hair is connected there, and when it's connected is the time period for when the hair grows. The second stage, it actually detaches, and then the third stage is when it dies off and another one sprouts up. But the way the actual biology between men and women work is the time period for how long the actual growing period is at least double men. So it's even just in the biology how that works. I mean, that's just how God has ordered things. And he's saying, look, if you look out into the world, you will see women, longer hair, and he's saying you should notice that that is a natural type of covering that a man does not have. And this should simply indicate to you, by looking out in nature, you see the woman, she's got a natural covering that God has given her that you don't have, men. And he says, if you look out there and you should see it, that should indicate to you that God wants her covered. That's what he's saying. He's not saying that the hair is the covering. He's saying you look out, you see the woman, she has a type of covering, and that should indicate to you that God wants her covered. That's how he desires things to be. Her natural covering, her hair, is of sorts. Her glorious hair is a type. It's a type of covering. And he's saying, look, since she has that one by nature, it should indicate that she should have this one. You see how that works there? What he's trying to get us to see by this nature argument? I'll come back to that argument when I deal with how other people have interpreted this verse near the end. So then in verse 16, we've made it. So he's going to make his final claim. And this is, again, Paul had his last question that started back there in verse 13. And he began his descent, so to speak. And so he's going to make another claim here, and it's in connection with that question back there in verse 13, when he asked, is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? And he says, if anyone is inclined to be contentious, that is, if anyone is inclined to contend about what we're teaching, if anyone is wanting to take issue with this, with discerning whether it's proper for a wife to pray with her head uncovered, he says, we have no such practice, nor do the churches of God. So notice what Paul is saying. He's saying if anyone is out there wanting to contend for no head covering, he's saying, look, if anyone's out there wanting to say, no, we don't need the head covering when a woman's praying or prophesying, he says they need to know that that is not only not our view, that's not the view of any of the churches of God. And sometimes people want to come to this passage, come to this verse 16, and they want to say that what Paul is saying is, if anyone is out there being contentious about the head coverings thing and doesn't want to wear one, well, that's fine. We don't really hold this view, and she doesn't need to wear one, and neither do any of the churches of God hold this view. It's like, what? I mean, Paul just spent the last 14 verses arguing why a wife should cover her head. Why would he come to verse 16 and go, oh yeah, if you don't want to do it, yeah, we don't even do it anyway. It makes no sense why Paul would be saying that. The interpretation would make no sense. And some translations actually change the wording here to make it a little more clear, and they say, we have no other practice, trying to give some clarity here about what he's actually saying. But the reality is, the actual underlying language, the Greek, does say we have no such practice. And so the question needs to be, okay, Paul, what practice are you talking about? You say we have no such practice, so we have to ask, okay, what is that in reference to? When he says you have no such practice, what practice are you talking about? Well, he just asked us the question back in verse 13. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? He asks, is it proper? You judge it, folks. Is it proper for a wife to pray with her head uncovered? And he wants the church to understand that practice, wives praying with their heads uncovered, is not their practice, and it is not the practice of any other church. And on a final note here, the fact that he says, nor do the churches of God, I mean, this is clearly an indication that this has nothing to do with the cultural situation in Corinth. Because, brethren, he says, you should all do this because we do this, and all the churches do this. Not just Corinth does this, all the churches of God do this. And so he's telling them, look, if you step out of line here and you don't do this, if you don't practice this divinely delivered tradition, which in another place Paul says stand firm in, hold to these things, then you're the one that's falling out of line with all the churches of God, because we all practice this kind of thing. It's clearly not a cultural situation just to the church at Corinth. So, that is the layout of the text. So, some conclusions here. And I want to ask you these questions, and I want you to defend them with a Bible verse. So the first question is this: who ought to wear a head covering, wives or all women? Wives. Why?
Because the scripture says that it's to honor our husbands. So if you're single, you don't have a husband to honor.
Right? So let me go back to that initial question I said in the beginning again. What the New Testament teaches about submission, does it teach all women are submitted to all men, or that wives are submitted to their husbands? Right. And what are some of the verses again? What did you quote?
Ephesians 5:22.
Okay. Huh? 5:20?
21.
Ephesians 5:21? 1 Peter 3:1? Okay, these are verses that teach this reality. Okay? So who ought to wear it? Wives. Second question, when should she wear it? All the time or at certain times? So let's go to the text, right? Who said something? Oh.
Praying and prophesying.
Okay, give me a Bible verse.
Corinthians 11, verse 4.
Okay. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. Verse 5. Every wife who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. All right. You have it there in verse 13 as well. Is it proper for a wife to pray? So he only says pray there. He doesn't say prophesy, but... Right? So the when. When should she do it? Anytime she's praying or prophesying. Verse 5 and verse 13. Now, how about this one? What kind of head covering does it need to be? This one's a trick question.
One that covers the head.
What kind of covering?
Something that covers.
I mean, that's what the Greek says.
So the thing is this.
Oh, yeah, it's a
Paul...
outside thing,
Huh?
like
Okay.
a external.
Well, what I mean is this. Yeah, it is external. But what I mean to say, maybe this question wasn't that clear. Because the answer is Paul doesn't say. He does not give us any particular rules about what the head covering should look like, how big it should be, the color, none of that stuff. There's no standards here about any of that. Paul does not say what the head covering should be. I remember when we were visiting in Kansas City the first time, and I was sitting down and talking to Mike about this passage. That was the first time really where I felt like the ideas that I had in the passage, I didn't feel like I was so out in left field. He's talking to me about, his wife was already doing that. And I felt like, wow, I'd never seen that before, but I was so convinced of it, but I just never seen it before. And I remember talking to him, I'm like, brother, well, what does it need to be? And he goes, well, Paul doesn't say. Paul doesn't say at all what it should be. I mean, she could put a piece of saran wrap on her head. And I was like, well, I don't know about that. But you get the point, right? Paul does not say what the covering should be. He doesn't say what it should look like, how long it should be, what color it should be. There's no stipulations there. So I guess the only thing I would say about this question is this. The wife is the glory of her husband. And Paul says that her hair is given to her as her glory. And so in Paul's theology, he would seem to be teaching us that in the moments when a wife is to cover her head, when she's praying or prophesying, that she should veil or cover her own glory so as to glory her husband. All right? So then the idea is this. The intent should be to cover your glory. I mean, that should be the intent. That should be the idea. But there's no standard for this. There's no legalistic rule here about what it should look like. And again, the idea of veiling or covering your glory, ladies, is very Christ-like. I mean, that is exactly what he did. When he came to live amongst mankind, what did he do? He put off something. He put off his glory. He set it aside. And so that's the idea. Trying to debate what particular kind of head covering it needs to be worn would be like asking, well, what grapes did they use during the Lord's Supper? I mean, we got to be specific here, folks. We got to make sure we use the exact same kind of wine they used. I mean, it's just not important in the argument. And so let's just deal with 3 of these. Here are 3 counter arguments for how people interpret this passage. Okay, so the first argument is this. Some want to say that long hair is the covering. That, yes, a woman should cover her head, but the long hair is the covering. And they say that because of what verse 15 says. But if woman has long hair, it is her glory, for her hair is given to her for a covering. Now, the problem with this is this. All the way through the passage, the covering is removable. It's used in certain circumstances. So unless the idea is when she prays or prophesies, she needs to make sure she grows her hair long, but other than that, she can cut her hair off. It really doesn't make any sense. And also, look at verse 6, because I want you to see if that's true, that long hair is the covering intended. I want you to see how foolish this verse sounds. I'm going to replace, in the verse here, in verse 6, I'm going to replace cover the head with how some people interpret the covering as long hair. All right? And here's what verse 6 would say if that's the case. For if a wife will not have long hair, then she should cut her hair short. Do you see? If she doesn't have long hair, doesn't she already have short hair? Are you seeing this? Is this clear? Okay. So the verse makes absolutely no sense. If what the covering means is long hair, and yet we go to verse 6, and if we interchange the two, of what Paul is saying is, if a wife will not have long hair, then she should cut her hair short. Well, she already would have hair short if she didn't have long hair. So obviously it doesn't make sense. And it really kind of makes the whole argument kind of useless. I mean, Paul, why are you even getting into this? Just say, ladies, don't cut your hair. Well, what is the point of this whole passage? The other argument is this, that the head covering was only necessary for cultural reasons. And the issue with this is that the head covering, folks, in Paul's argumentation, has to do with grander things than the cultural situation. Now, I may grant that there were cultural situations going on, but Paul's reasoning is not rooted in that. Paul's reasoning seems to be rooted in the fact that woman is the glory of man. There's something far more fundamental here. And folks, if God, in the Holy Scriptures, gives us a reason for something, we should not substitute it for something else. If God gives us a reason, and He roots it in this reasons connected to creation and even the angels, brethren, don't substitute it for something else. God gave us a reason for it. And these reasons are rooted in something far deeper than avoiding cultural sins. And not only that, the fact of the matter is, this was in many ways anti-cultural. In that day, the men were the ones that covered their heads. The Greeks and the Romans would cover their heads. They would pull their togas over their heads when they were going to pray or offer some kind of incense to their deities. And the Jewish men would cover their heads. In fact, to this day, Jewish men still wear a covering on their heads. The priests were especially those who would cover their heads. And so Paul is giving a distinctly Christian custom. Men, don't cover your heads like the others do. He's wanting to separate something out here. Men, don't do that. They do that. They don't recognize that they are the glory of God. He's saying, men, Christian men, you don't do that. Women, do it. You're under your husband's authority. Display that. Display that submission of authority there. Now the last one is this. The head covering is just a symbol. All right? And he says that. I mean, just so you know, in verse 10, when it says the wife ought to have a symbol of authority on her head, the word symbol is not in the original. It actually just says the woman ought to have authority on her head. But they put this here in pretty much every translation because, I mean, that is the idea of what Paul's getting at. But the point is this. They'll come to the text here, and they'll interpret it, and they'll say, yeah, the head covering is a symbol of authority. And that particular symbol was the way that they showed this whole concept of submitting and being the glory of man. That particular symbol was the way they did it. And we need to find a way that we do it in our own culture. There's no real obligation to keep the same symbol, just the principle. And of course, this is kind of connected with the whole cultural argument. And here's the answer to this. First thing is this. I'm not so sure, brethren, that we want to mess with God's symbols. There are a lot of things in the Bible that are symbols. What other things in the Bible do we do that are symbols?
The Lord's Supper.
Lord's Supper, baptism. What other things are said to be symbols in the Bible? Marriage. I mean, there's potentially others as well. But those are certainly the biggest ones. And let me ask you this. Do any of you feel at liberty to change the symbols of Lord's Supper, of baptism, of marriage? I mean, folks, if we start losing one, what's to say that we can't lose all of them? And in fact, you might think, well, what in the world? What's the connection to those things? Well, people have done that. People have separated themselves from these symbols. Listen to this. The Salvation Army, they have changed out water baptism and communion for other things. They do not baptize new believers. They have a process for someone becoming a soldier in the Salvation Army. And to become a soldier, you need to, of course, be a professing believer. But they say this, the new convert should publicly express their desire to be a part of Christ's church. And we would say, yeah, baptize them. That's the New Testament symbol for that. But they don't do that. So the public confession for them, now this is straight off of their website. I knew this was the case, so I tried to go on Salvation Army's website to find it. I mean, they're so off in left field now, I can't even imagine what William Booth would think about Salvation Army now. But regardless of that, you can't find any doctrinal stuff on the United States Salvation Army website. Nothing. So I had to go to India's Salvation Army website to find this. But it's the same. And so they say this, that the public confession, we would do baptism. The New Testament would teach baptism. But the Salvation Army says that the public confession is expressed by the swearing in of a soldier under the Salvation Army beneath the Trinitarian sign of the Army's flag. So they do this sort of swearing in under the Trinitarian flag of the Salvation Army. And so they say this, that symbol for them takes place of water baptism. They go on to say this, the swearing in is a public response and witness to a life-changing encounter with Christ, which has already taken place, as is the water baptism practiced by some other Christians. The Salvation Army acknowledges The Salvation Army acknowledges that there are many worthy ways of proclaiming witness to have been baptized into Christ's body by the Holy Spirit and expressing a desire to be His disciple. And they do the same thing regarding communion. They say that the soldier of the Salvation Army needs to find their own ways and their own culture with their own symbols to celebrate Christ's death. And so people are doing this. The symbols, they're cultural, but we can come over here, we can find our own symbols to say the same kind of things. And even our Presbyterian brethren. I mean, folks, listen, the reality is this. When they decide to sprinkle someone with water instead of immersing them, they decimate the whole symbolism of baptism. What's the symbolism, folks, with baptism? Buried with Christ, raised to newness of life. Folks, when you flick water on someone's head, that hardly symbolizes death. Hardly symbolizes death. They've destroyed the whole symbol. And listen, even consider this. You guys are here. Listen, I didn't put this in here for this was written way before you guys were going to come. But think about this. If someone goes to an unreached people, an unreached context, right? And they plant a church in the midst of a completely unreached people who have no context of the Bible, have no context of our culture, have no context of biblical culture, you know what? The symbols of baptism and the Lord's Supper will have no reference to them. They won't have any connection to the symbols of the Lord's Supper and baptism. Their culture will not likely have practiced anything like that. So can we change the symbols? I mean, should we remove those symbols and maybe use a symbol that has more of a cultural meaning? I mean, there's a lot of these cultures where one thing they do is they have people walk across hot coals. So now, and that's more fitting for their culture. So now, if we've reached these unreached people, can we say, yeah, I mean, we could do baptism, but that doesn't mean anything to them? So now, instead of baptism to display their commitment to Christ, they'll walk across the hot coals. That will be their display of a public commitment to Christ. I mean, I don't think so, brethren. I don't think so. And I think we need to be concerned in the same way with keeping this biblical symbol. We don't want to get rid of it. We shouldn't interchange it with something that we've come up with on our own. And people have done, I mean, people think this way. I recently listened to a little clip of a guy, Dan Wallace. I mean, when it comes to textual stuff, the guy's a genius. But when it comes to this text, I mean, I don't even know how he deals with this problem. But he basically says, yeah, that was a cultural symbol in ours. You know, maybe what we should do is all the elders of each church should get together and determine how they're going to do this in their own church. What? I mean, we got every church doing something different to display these realities. So listen, I think we need to be careful here that we don't get rid of God's symbolism. Folks, if people don't understand Christian symbols, we shouldn't get rid of them. We should teach them, right? Paul's intention is to say, I want you to understand why you should do this. And we should want the same thing. Brethren, this is Christian symbolism. It means something for us. And even if other cultures don't get it, we teach it and then we practice it. We maintain, we hold firm, we stand upon the traditions that have been handed down to us. Apostolic traditions, divine traditions, things that God has told us. So, any questions? I have a few. Yeah.
Is this the only text in Scripture about head covering?
Well, there are other passages, as I said, about in the Old Testament of women covering their heads. But as far as a teaching on head coverings, yes.
Okay, that kind of goes with the other question. As far as the type of head coverings, when you were saying, like Paul doesn't say, with the references to the Old Testament, and they use veils, would that be something more that we should use versus just the little scarves that we might wear because of the Old Testament ideas?
Yeah, so this is where, I mean, in the Scriptures, there are contextual things. I mean, there are things that happened because that is the way that they lived. I mean, it's not to say that everything is transferred directly across to every culture, no matter what. So, I mean, they wore sandals everywhere. I mean, what Jesus says, for example, when you go into a city, if they won't accept you, right, knock the dust off your shoes and move on, right? So, I mean, does this mean that every time we do evangelism, we need to wear sandals and actually like wipe the dust off our feet when they don't want to listen? So there are some things cultural. So what I would say in this respect is, because Paul does not define for us what the head covering needs to be, I don't think there's anything there that would seem to indicate that it has to be a particular type. The idea is that she is to cover her glory. That's the idea. So can you do that with a veil? Yes. Can you do that even with a hat? Yes. Can you do that with I don't know what you'd call that thing, but whatever that thing is, that buckles in the back. Yeah. So I think especially, now there's not a lot of information on this, so this is somewhat my own speculations, but at least in regards to the Old Testament, I think one of the reasons why it was probably some kind of larger veil or shawl is because it was actually part of the outfit. So they would actually wear it and it would just be on them, and whenever they needed to, they could just pick it up and cover their head, and then they could drop it back down as part of the... So, I mean, is that something that someone could do today? Of course it could. But I think the idea is what is intended to be done? Well, what's intended to be done is to cover the head for particular reasons,
And so because Paul doesn't say it needs to be this covering or that covering, or it needs to be this long or this color, or it has to be this way, I just don't think there's anything there that would require us to put some kind of stipulation on that, so long as it does what it's intended to do, to cover the glory. That's the idea. So could there be a sense in which someone puts something on their head that doesn't accomplish that task? Well, yeah, of course. I mean, Madeline has something on her head right now, right? but putting the hair back in a ponytail and putting I don't know what all these things are called. Yeah, hair tie, right? Okay, does that do? Now, obviously, right now there's no theological implication that says you would need to have that right now. But the point is, does that do what Paul is wanting it to do in the text? No. So and is there a line somewhere there where we would say, okay, that actually doesn't cover the glory, cover your hair, and then over here this does. I mean, maybe there's a line somewhere, but I sort of want to avoid any legalistic tendency of saying, here's what it needs to look like, here's how thick it needs to be, all of that kind of thing. So long as it is accomplishing the task for which Paul is wanting it accomplished, I think we're in a good place. Did you have something?
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question when you're done.
You can go ahead, I'll come back. I got quite a few.
Okay. Real quick, you mentioned that up until about 80 years ago, this was in place. In the church. Was it the Sunday bonnet?
Yeah, so
That's getting close to my generation.
right. So there was transition here, especially within that period of time. So even on into the 50s, it was very common for women to cover their heads in church, and it
Hat.
right with a hat,
Little-
right?
And
Yeah.
then they became really ornate.
Right. Yeah. So, but I think if you read some of the commentators and people, the theology was still the same. The way it was worked out had some distinction, and I think what kind of sort of happened was you had people that made the floppy hat sort of famous in their wearing of it, especially like Queen of England and this kind of thing. And so that kind of transferred into culture. So I guess my point is to say, even though exactly what the head covering was has more recently in our culture changed, it really wasn't that way for that long. The idea of using mostly a hat, that was kind of a newer idea during that time period. Now, I don't think there's anything wrong with a hat. It works perfectly fine to do what it's intended to do. However, that was sort of a newer way of applying the principle. Even to this day, the Amish and the Mennonites, they have a couple of different ways in which they'll cover their heads, and a lot of times they will use some kind of a bonnet like that to do it. So there has of course been some change in how what they culturally would put on their head, but the theological idea of doing it had pretty much maintained up until about that time. And it's only been up until then, or only since then, where the church has begun to veer off in thinking that was continuing to be applicable biblically.
So historically, to just further my question, historically, what was used before the hats came into vogue maybe 150 years ago?
Yeah, some
What
kind of
was
cloth
just a-
covering.
Just a plain simple.
Yeah, some kind of cloth covering. Again, it's like whether it was big enough to wear as part of a whole outfit that would cover, come down and be able to be picked up, or whether it was something smaller. I haven't really looked into what may have been the most common form, but it would be some kind. What would have been normative before the hat would have been some kind of cloth covering. Or back to you.
Verse 4, prophecies, could that be translated as preaching and teaching?
It could be understood that way. It certainly can't be translated that way. The word is prophecy. Now, defining what prophecy might be, that's a bigger question. That is one that I am not going to answer. For a number of reasons. Number one, I don't want to veer off track right here, okay? Depending on how someone might define prophecy, there might be an application that is added here of when a wife should cover her head. Right now, we don't have any women prophets. However, we might want to define that. So the application for us is verse 13. Is it proper for a wife to pray to God with her head uncovered? All right? So can it be translated teaching? No. Could it be understood that way? I think yes. Broadly speaking. But yeah, I mean, I could share with you maybe some other thoughts about that after. It ties into what Paul gets into in chapter 12, 13, and 14, especially in 14 when he's mentioning the prophets speaking in the church. And he basically says that a woman should not speak in the assembly, in the gathering. And of course, he's not saying she can't say any words, but the idea is as the prophets are speaking, or there's teaching, there's interpretation, there's authoritative biblical proclamation, he's saying in that role they shouldn't take. So, however we want to understand prophecy in this case, it seems probably most likely that it's something outside of the assembly of the church, because Paul says in that context they shouldn't be doing it. So, yeah, there's big discussion, even bigger than what this text means. If there's anything bigger than what head coverings is, it's prophecy. So I'm gonna table that one for Manny sometime. But yeah, for us the application is mostly going to be praying.
I don't know if I missed it, but because I am very tired, I apologize.
That's okay.
But is this just for corporate prayer, or is this prayer when you're at home together as well?
So this is where, again, people will differ on exactly how they're going to apply this. I'll give you my understanding, and I guess anybody else would have to really dig into the text to try to see. I think this has to do with any time a woman is praying or a wife is praying or prophesying. So whether she's at home, whether she's in the church, whether she's alone, or whether she's with other people. Now, the reason for that is a couple of reasons. Number one, Paul's arguments here, again, what are his reasonings? He roots this in the created order, and he roots this, at least to some degree, in the angels. Both of those things don't go away when a wife is at home by herself. If she's at home by herself, God is still concerned about how he created things, and the angels still exist. So I think that the application is any time a wife is praying and prophesying. And I think the other thing to be said is this. We have to ask why. Like, Paul, why are these the times when it needs to happen, when she's praying or prophesying? Why not other things? Why doesn't he say there's other things that when she's doing this, she should cover her head? And I think the reason is this. When the praying or the prophesying is happening, she is entering into a spiritual realm with the Lord. When she's praying, she's coming into the throne room of God, and it is there where she needs to be intent to have this symbol of authority and display God's created order. I mean, she's before God. When she's prophesying, the idea would be that now she's speaking for God. And in the same way, there's this spiritual realm here that she's now entering into. And I think the idea of her having this display of submission is why it's important in those particular contexts. I mean, he doesn't say when she goes to the grocery store, let her cover her head. I mean, these are here for a reason. Why? Why pray and prophesy? And the only thing I can come up with is that there's some spiritual reality happening here. And you know what? That spiritual reality is the case whether she prays in the midst of the corporate body or whether she prays at home. I mean, if she's by herself on her couch and no one else is around, she is still entering the throne room of God. And I think God is intending. This is the other thing. Sometimes, this, especially first starting to understand it, I think what can happen is women can go, oh, geez, now I got to do this thing. Like now I got to, I have to do something. I have to take this action. And the thing is, I think God, when we understand it rightly, this is good. Like I told Manny today on the phone, I said, brother, as I've just been reading through this passage, I mean, I don't know, Paul might rebuke me for saying this when I see him in heaven, but I honestly feel like I wish that there was something like this for men. And the reason I say that is because there is some kind of reality where when we are doing something physical, it helps us spiritually. When I'm if I'm by myself praying, I will always pray on my knees. And I do that because I'm wanting to physically put myself in a position where I am trying to put myself in submission to God. And the head covering is not intended to be like, oh, here's this command, now you got to do this, you got to make sure you have it and look for it, and here's this slavish type thing you need to do as a woman. I think Paul is trying to get us to see, wives, sisters, this is how you will have freedom to come to the Lord. I mean, bring yourself in submission, display it in this way, and have liberty before the throne of God. And so I think when we begin to think about it properly, it's not this slavish thing of obedience. It's a thing that God has given you for your freedom, for your liberty, for your joy, for your help in the midst of doing things that are spiritually powerful. And I guess all I would say is, because of that, those realities don't go away when she goes home by herself. So my understanding is that it's anytime she's praying or prophesying. Some people will disagree with that and say, well, the church, this is a letter written to a church and how the church should operate. And so they'll say, well, it's about the outworkings of church life. And so they say it only applies during the church meeting. I just think his idea is deeper than that. So.
Quick question. Why just married women then?
Well, so that's rooted in trying to bring all of Scripture in, because the idea is a display of authority to who. And part of that is the Bible teaches that a wife is submitted to her husband, that every woman is not submitted to every man. And so I'm trying to evaluate Scripture with Scripture. And if the Bible doesn't teach me that every woman is to be submitted to every man, but a wife is to be submitted to her husband, and that's part of Paul's argument, then I think the proper way to understand it is wife. So, yeah, I mean, there's not anything else here that would necessarily help us to determine the translation, because like I said, woman and wife are the same word in Greek. So we have to use either something in the context to determine it, which there is not anything extra here to help us determine it. So we have to go to the Scripture and determine, okay, who is submitted to whom in these kind of relationships? Well, the Scripture is clear that a wife is submitted to her husband. And so for that reason, I think to understand it properly, we have to bring that reality in.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Well, so to clarify, would a single woman, when they're praying at home,
Well, again, yeah, I mean, you of course would be free to do that if that was something that you felt led to do. I guess if I'm just going to deal with what is in the passage and how I can bring in other Scripture to understand it, I can't seem to get anywhere but to say the wife is the one who is in focus here, because of this whole idea of submission. So that seems to be the implication and how it should be worked out. And again, that's the whole idea is again rooted in God's created order. You think about what happened in Genesis. And Paul fleshes this out when he talks about his prohibition against women pastors. And he says that she shouldn't have that authority because she was the one that deceived, right? She was the one that was deceived, and then she gave to her husband to eat. And so what happened there was this breaking of the order where Adam failed to function as a husband and protect his wife, but Eve also failed, and she deceived her husband and had him to eat. And so I think what is happening here is a wife is to indicate, I'm submitted to my husband, he's my spiritual leader, he's my guide. That's the idea. And that submission only functions in the realm of a husband-wife relationship. All through Scripture. That's the now, why is that the case? I don't know. Why is it the case that a single woman is not submitted to some man? I mean, I guess it would be, a single woman would be submitted to her father until she's married. But the implication of submitted to another man in that relationship is really only in the marriage relationship, at least through the rest of Scripture. So I have to some degree bring that in to try to help interpret and define which word is best used in the text. Anything else?
I have a statement, not a question.
Are you going to prophesy?
No. When I did lose on my hair,
Uh-huh.
and you were talking about that, and how you said that, like God wired us that you want to cover your head. You know, the woman wants to have hair,
Mm-hmm.
and it's even embedded in children because like after it had started getting warm outside, and I didn't cover my head because I was very, self-conscious of my head, and like it was getting warm out, and so from the house to the truck, there are kids outside playing, and so, I had some kids do like this, like look at me. So it's already embedded even in children that, it's not natural, But then I started feeling, throughout the time, I started feeling like I was vain because I wanted my hair back. I wanted my eyebrows back. And so I was feeling like, I was being prideful, but I didn't realize what you said that, as far as the word saying, God designed us like that to want to have hair as a woman.
Yeah, I mean, God says it's given to you for your glory. There's nothing about that to be shameful about, to desire.
I wanted to maybe just something interesting too is men, we already practice this, right? So we don't, and this is kind of natural with us too. When a guy's praying, what's he going to do? All the time he's wearing a hat. Like we asked Dave to pray right now, and Dave prayed, he would take his hat off.
Right.
We always do that. We guys already do this naturally. It's just innate. It's just already in us. We already know. We take our hat off. It's just, you don't pray or don't preach in a hat or whatever.
Well, and the thing is, again, someone might want to come back to that and say, yeah, we don't do that because in our culture that's weird. Like, yeah, the little children thought that when you lost your hair, that's weird because they just don't see people that often with bald heads, especially women. But if they saw a lot of women with bald heads, then they would think it was normal. And I'm going to say, no, I don't think so. I think there's something more there than it's just not normal for them.
It also makes you feel very masculine. I remember feeling like that. Like, even like right now, I'm not comfortable with this short because I've always had long hair. But it does put a...
Well, it's longer than Neil's.
Yeah, but I remember feeling like that. Like, it does make you feel masculine.
Well, I tried to make it clear, but I do want you recognize that obviously what I'm saying is not something that should make you feel indicted in any way, as though the fact that you have short hair now because you just went through chemo is some kind of problem. I think you recognize that as a woman you desire something, and because of the fall and because of sin, it was taken from you. And it is proper and biblical for you to want to return back to having that glory. So, all right, well, I'm going to pray.